Hello all, my name is Neeraj Kabra. I'm an associate advocate at Law Chamber of Siddharth Murarka and I'm the host for today's session. Today we have speaker Advocate Noshad Engineer. He is a practicing counsel in Bombay High Court. He will be enlightening us on today's topic, that is admission, denial and marking of documents in civil trial. I request Noshad sir to kindly take over and start with his lecture.
Thank you. And once again, thanks to the Siddharth Murarka and his entire team for organizing these series of lectures in that sense. And thank you for having me back again. So coming straight to the topic of what we're going to discuss today is the marking of documents in a civil trial. Now, I'm sure all of us in that sense who wanted to become lawyers, I think the most exciting part of any case actually is the trial, and especially cross-examination and, proving your case in that sense. However, most of what happens today, especially in the High Court, is more of an interlocutory stage, where whatever documents are annexed in the plaint is what you can rely upon in order to establish your prima facie case so that you can get a form of interim relief. However, when it comes to trial, every document that is annexed to the plaint is not something which is what the terminology is not a document which is marked into evidence automatically. This process of marking is really what we're going to discuss today. And this is something which is important because in a civil trial, contrary to what happens in, say, in criminal jurisprudence, normally in our civil trials, when you're dealing with contracts or you're dealing with suits for specific performance, there is always going to be a documentary trail. There's always going to be some form of documentary evidence. Now, if these documents are not admitted into evidence at the stage of marking of documents, then you cannot rely upon those documents at the final hearing after all the evidence is recorded. So it is imperative that we need to know and understand what really is marking of documents, what are the objections that can be taken for marking of documents, and what is it that you need to prove for getting these documents marked. And also, what is the effect really of marking of a document? Does it mean that the minute the document is marked into evidence, that document is proved? So we'll be touching upon this in the course of today's lecture. I have basically broken this down into about 5 or 6 subtopics. The first of which I'll be dealing with really is, what is documentary evidence? What are the types? The second is, what are the types of documentary evidence? Third is going to be is that when can documents be submitted into evidence? At what stage? Can you do it later? Are there any restrictions or requirements for submitting documents after the prescribed stage for submitting of documents? Fourth, I'll be dealing then with the objections that can be raised. What are these types of objections? How are these objections to be dealt with? Then the main nub really is, what is marking of documents and what do you need to prove and establish to get your documents marked, and what is the effect of marking? So this is basically how I propose to take you all through this subject of marking of documents. So the first thing, as I indicated, is what really is documentary evidence. Now, we all know that evidence is essentially of two types. It can either be oral testimony or it could be documentary. So, Neeraj, if you could just come up to section 3. Yes, okay, you've put it up on the
Yes,
screen.
sir.
So, if we see section 3 of the Evidence Act, section 3 describes what is, if first just see the definition of evidence. It says that evidence means and includes all statements which the court permits or requires to be made before it by witnesses in relation to matters of fact under inquiry. Such statements are called oral evidence. And 2, all documents, including electronic records, produced for the inspection of the court. Such documents are called documentary evidence. So evidence is of two types. One is the statements that are made by witnesses in court which is your oral evidence, and two is the documentary evidence. So now today we're going to be dealing with documentary evidence, and document is also defined. If we see the definition, document means any matter expressed or described upon any substance by means of letters, figures, marks, or by more than one of those means intended to be used or which may be used for the purpose of recording that matter. And when we see the illustrations, a writing is a document. Words printed, lithographed, or photographed are documents. A map or a plan is a document. An inscription on a metal plate or a stone is a document. Even a drawing or a caricature can also be a document. So document is very widely described. It's not only a letter or something which contains alphabets. It can be numbers, it can be photographs, it can even be drawings. And we then just see the definition of proved, because this is something also which is important, because in a civil trial, we all know that unlike in criminal trials where you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt, in civil trial, we have what is called the theory of preponderance of probability. And that comes from the definition of proved in the Evidence Act. And if we see this definition, proved, a fact is said to be proved when, after considering the matters before it, the court either believes it to exist or considers its existence so probable that a prudent man ought, under the circumstances of the particular case, to act upon the supposition that it exists. So when you are to prove something, you have to establish that threshold or that minimum criteria that the court would consider its existence probable under the circumstances of a particular case. The court can act even upon a supposition that it must exist. So prove doesn't have to mean that there is no other alternative. It just necessarily means that it is more likely that this is what actually happened, or what we call preponderance of probability. So, and it's very important that whenever we're trying to prove any fact in issue, we must remember this definition of proved. So, essentially, when you are marking or when you are seeking to mark a document, what you are trying to do is prove that document. And you therefore have to essentially establish 3 or 4 criteria, which I'll come to a little later in the talk, that document, the court should suppose that it in fact does exist and does say what it says, and it is in fact correct. So that deals with the first part on what is documentary evidence. So it is essentially any evidence which is a record of a matter which may be written, photographed, or drawn on any sort of substance, and which is available and which is a record of what has transpired. Now, when we then see as to what are the types of documentary evidence, that essentially you will find in section 74 of the Evidence Act. If we could just quickly turn to 74. Yeah, 74, please. Yes. Now, 74, I mean, just broadly speaking, you can either have documents which are private documents or public documents. A third category really is certified copy of documents. And there is a fourth category, if I may put it loosely, is documents which are more than 30 years old. But under the Evidence Act, really speaking, there are 2 types. Now, when we see section 74, 74 says that defines what is a public document. It says the following documents are public documents. 1, documents forming the act or record of the acts of the sovereign authority or of official bodies and tribunals and of public officers, legislative, judicial and executive of any part of India or Commonwealth of a foreign country. And 2 is very important. Public records kept in any state of private documents. So when we see what is a public document, one obviously is it is a document which forms the record of the acts of the sovereign authority or of official bodies and tribunals or public officers, legislative, judicial, executive. And 2 is a public record kept of private documents. So it's important to note that even if you enter into a sale transaction with an individual and that document is registered and that original is registered with the sub-registrar of assurances, that document is in fact a public document because it is a record, a public record kept of a private document and therefore comes under the definition of public documents. This assumes significance, as we'll see a little later on, because of the presumptions that the law attaches to a public document. Now, if we see 75, it says all other documents are private. So there are two, the Evidence Act basically divides them into 2 types. One is public documents and the other is private documents. So your private documents typically are going to be correspondence, letters exchanged, maybe even drafts that were exchanged between parties, or any writing which is not forming part of any public official's record. Those are all private documents. 76 then talks about certified copies of public documents. Says that every public officer having the custody of a public document, which any person has a right to inspect, shall give that person on demand a copy of it on payment of the legal fees therefore, together with a certificate written at the foot of such copy, that it is a true copy of such document or part thereof, as the case may be, and such certificate shall be dated and subscribed by such officer with his name and his official title, and shall be sealed whenever such officer is authorized by law to make use of such seal. And such copies so certified shall be called certified copies. So in that sense, this is a third category, you may put it this way, is that the certified copy of a public document is also a type of document to which certain presumptions will arise, which again I'll be coming to when it comes to the presumptions. And the fourth, as I indicated, was documents that are more than 30 years old. Now, obviously, a document, whether it be a public document or a private document, if it is more than 30 years old, then again, the Evidence Act under Section 90 attaches to that document a presumption about its existence. So, when we are considering the types of documentary evidence that we will deal with, is 4 broad categories: private, public, certified copies, and documents which are more than 30 years old. So now, once this is just broadly as a preface, the main issue now really is that when can documents be submitted in court which would be considered as forming part of the court's record for the final hearing? Now, as I had indicated, when you annex documents to your plaint, and at the motion stage, as we are all very used to, we look at all the documents and then we basically argue as if the documents we want to rely upon are the gospel truth, and the court must consider them at that prima facie case. However, when it's at the time of trial, what actually happens at this stage is this. And it's important to note because sometimes I've seen that different judges in different courts and different tribunals have followed different procedures also. I mean, there are some cases where you find that judges will be saying, after the interlocutory stages are over, they say, okay, yes, come on, next is issues. After issues, yes, you file your compilation of documents and your statement of admission and denial. And after that, then they come to the evidence, or they say evidence and documents at the same stage. But if we are to go strictly by the CPC, then what happens is that the matter comes up on board for direction. And at that, under Order 11, Rule 13 the court will actually ask for what is known as inspection and discovery. And they will then say that yes, parties are to submit their affidavit of documents. And that affidavit of documents is a form by which a party is to candidly state all the documents that he has in his possession, of which he is aware, and even those which may not be in his possession, but of which he is aware, which relate to the facts in issue. Once that is done, there are statements of admission and denial, which are to be exchanged between the parties. So each other party knows which documents the other side is admitting to or denying. Now, this, of course, is not something which you will find in the CPC. But if you see, for our Commercial Courts Act now, the Order 11 has been amended, and you have to give a detailed statement of admission and denial, including the reasons on which you wish to deny a particular document. Once that is done, under Order 13, we have to file a compilation of documents. At the compilation of documents stage, all the documents that you wish to rely upon must be there. Based upon that, the issues are then framed under Order 14. And you'll note that under Order 14, Rule 3, it says that issues can be framed from the pleadings and from the documents that are submitted. So when this process gets inverted sometimes, and you'll find that people will say, no, first we'll frame issues, then we'll come to documents. Actually, then be right in pointing out that, sorry, we first have to file our documents. And because even based upon those documents, we can frame issues under Order 14, Rule 3. Now, one thing which is very important to note is that, and I'm especially for the younger listeners today, you all probably don't know this, but the old practice was that when you used to file your plaint, you didn't even need to, in fact, annex all the documents. You could simply say, I crave leave to refer to and rely upon. And normally in the list of documents which was annexed with the plaint, people would just simply say correspondence exchanged prior to the suit. But that all has been done away with by the 2002 amendment. Today, if we now see Order 7, Rule 14, Sub-Rule 3, and if we can just turn to that, Neeraj.
Yes, sir. Order 7, Rule 14, right?
Yes. While he puts it up on the screen, I'll just tell you what Order 7, Rule 14, Rule 3 says. It now says that all the documents which you wish to rely upon must be submitted in court at the time of filing of the plaint. The earlier practice of saying, I crave leave to refer to and rely upon is now done away with. You have to submit these documents along with your plaint. The idea was that the record then is obviously going to be kept carefully. There is no question, because in the olden days, if a suit was coming up after 20 years, suddenly the person says, oh, but these documents are now misplaced. Though I crave leave to refer to rely upon it, I now don't have it. So now to do away with that, the idea was that whatever the documents are, they must all be brought in to the plaint at that particular time. Now, if we can just see Order 7, Rule 14. Neeraj, sorry, if you could just put up Order 7, Rule 14. This is only from the index which you're showing me. I want the actual text. That's Order 5. Yeah. Just
Yes.
come on further.
Sir, Order 14.
Yeah. Okay. So
Rule 14.
you see Order 7, Rule 14. Now please see what it says. It says, where a plaintiff sues upon a document or relies upon a document in his possession or power in support of his claim, he shall enter such document in a list and shall produce it in court when the plaint is presented by him, and shall at the same time deliver the document and a copy thereof to be filed with the plaintiff. Where any such document is not in the possession or power of the plaintiff, he shall, wherever possible, state in whose possession or power it is. Now see 14.3. A document which ought to be produced in court by the plaintiff when the plaint is presented, or to be entered in the list to be added or annexed to the plaint, but is not produced or entered accordingly, shall not, without the leave of the court, be received in evidence on his behalf at the hearing of the suit. So now, under 14.3, if there was a document which ought to have been produced by you at the time of the filing of the plaint, but you didn't produce it, then you cannot seek to at a later stage simply bring it in without seeking leave of the court. And very often I'll tell you, as counsel, you'll find sometimes that plaints are drafted hurriedly. Then even when it comes for directions, whatever is stated in the plaint, documents in the plaint are just put into the affidavit of documents and that's filed in court. And then when it comes time for evidence, the parties will approach and then you start looking at what is there. You then question the parties and say, but do you have this document? Do you have that? Then they say, yes, I have all this. And it's not actually forming a part of the plaint. It's not forming a part of the affidavit of documents also. And then at the time of evidence, you suddenly come up with additional compilations and you want that to be relied upon by the court. If you don't seek leave of the court to rely upon those documents, you cannot rely upon those documents, and the other side will object and say that these documents cannot even be considered. So there are 2 or 3 judgments which are important on this point. The first judgment is of the Bombay High Court. You can just note down the citation. It's 2014 SCC Online Bombay 1627, which is the case of MV Glory, which was a case where His Lordship's Justice Sriram had pointed out that you cannot try and slip in documents in this manner at the time of evidence, which were not forming part of your affidavit of documents or were not annexed to the claim. And if you do want to put them in, you must take leave of the court. He makes it clear that you don't have to file a separate application for that leave, but you must apply for leave in your affidavit of evidence itself. And you must explain, and when they say you have to come up with a good cause, which basically means is you have to explain why this document was not sought to be relied upon or produced earlier at the appropriate stage. If you have that reason, then of course those documents will be allowed to be taken on record. But if that is not there, then the documents may not be allowed to be taken on record. And on this point, 2 or 3 more judgments, which essentially deal with the manner in which the courts approach such applications. Is Justice Dalvi's judgment, which is a very instructive judgment of 2016. 3 Bombay Cases Reporter, page 401, in the case of Union of India versus IndusInd. There it was a case where at the stage of arguments, parties realized that some documents needed to be brought on record, and the court then considered whether under what circumstances documents could be produced at such a related stage. And it ultimately held that good cause is even lower than sufficient cause. And even if it may have been some negligence on the part of the party in not telling the advocate, or negligence of maybe the party gave the document to the advocate, but the advocate didn't initially put it in also. As long as it is not malifying, and as long as the genuineness of that document is not seriously disputed, then the courts basically adopt an approach of saying that they will be liberal and that they will allow such documents to be taken on record. 2 more judgments on the same lines, you can just note down, is 2006 5 Bombay Cases Reporter 602 and AIR 80 Bombay, page 387. On the converse side is 2010 for Bombay Cases Reporter, page 631, which basically says that this shouldn't be done in some casual manner. It shouldn't be exercised liberally, and a cause must in fact be made out. Now, as we all know, these are all matters really of discretion, facts from case to case. The in Justice Dalvi's case of Indocent, there was no real dispute to the documents. In fact, the other side had also sought to rely upon it, and it was therefore taken on record. But if a party chooses to suddenly produce a document which the court feels, well, if you had this document, it should have been produced by you at the first stage itself, and you're coming up with it now. The other side says, I dispute the signature. This doesn't seem to be genuine. Then it's really the court's discretion at that point of time to see whether it seems to be a mala fide attempt, whether this is some dishonest attempt, whether the document seems to have been got up only to get over a defense. So these are all issues that the court will weigh. It differs from case to case. But these judgments which I have highlighted just now basically set out the principles which are applied. So please bear these in mind. Read these judgments because they are helpful in that sense in setting out the principles on which you can seek to place reliance on documents even after the stage of the plaint or the affidavit of documents. And I skipped over this, I'm sorry. It's Order 13, Rule 1, which if you can just quickly see Order 13,
Yes, sir.
Rule 1. Okay. Order 13, Rule 1.
So 1 second.
Yes, now this is Order 12. So just come after this.
So 13.
Yeah. Now, please see this. It says original documents to be produced at or before the settlement of issues. The parties or their pleader shall produce on or before the settlement of issues all the documentary evidence in original where the copies thereof have been filed along with the plaint or the written statement. The court shall receive the documents so produced, provided that they are accompanied by an accurate list thereof prepared in such form as the High Court directs. So Order 13 tells us that on or before the settlement of issues, all the documents in original with the accurate list prepared in such form as the High Court directs, which is of course our affidavit of documents, must be submitted in court. So essentially you have the stage of the plaint under Order 7, Rule 14, where actually you should be placing everything you have on record. But the court does allow that under Order 13 also, up to the time of issues, any evidence that you have, you can in fact produce on record. And if it is, you don't do it by this particular stage, and you want leave then to rely upon documents at a later stage, then you have to make out a good cause as to why those documents were not why those documents were not relied upon earlier. And those judgments which I have given you set out the circumstances or the criteria which you are required to make out for getting that leave. So it's very important, and this is something which, I mean, I faced it recently also, where documents are sought to be, bungled in at the time of the affidavit of evidence when they were not referred to in the pleadings, when they may not have been actually forming part of the affidavit of documents. And if you're not informed of that and you prepare affidavit of evidence and you don't set out the reasons why these documents were not relied upon earlier, those documents won't go in. And obviously the fact that you want to rely upon them means they're important. And if they don't go in, you very well could lose your case. This is something which I really urge everyone to take important note of, and to make sure that when you are drafting the plaint itself at that stage, as far as possible, always take complete instructions. Don't do a rush job or an overnight job as far as possible. Of course, there are cases where you have no choice, but as far as possible, collect all the information at that stage itself and place it on record, make a reference to it in the list of documents, etc. So there is no difficulty at a later stage. So that really is the stages when documents can be considered. I only want to also draw your attention then to Order 40, Order 7, Rule 14(4), which also says that the idea that you are, sorry, under Order 14, Rule 3 and 4, that you don't have to produce all the documents. The exception is that when you are confronting a witness in the course of cross-examination, at that point of time, you can confront him with documents. They say that these requirements of your affidavit of documents and producing all of it at the time or before settlement of issues doesn't apply to that. So we'll touch upon that topic a little later, but that's also important. So broadly speaking, the two times when you can refile your documents, one is along with the plaint under Order 7, and the second then is going to be under Order 13 and Order 14 is at the time of settlement issues. Now, once these are the documents that are in, there is going to be a statement of admission and denial. And broadly speaking, the objections that people will take will either be to the existence of the document, saying that we have never received this document, we don't even know that this document exists. So they deny the existence of the document. They also can say, yes, this document may have been received, or I'm aware of this document, but this document has not been signed by the person who purports to have signed it. They may say it's a forged signature. So they may dispute either the signature or the handwriting in which it is, if it is a handwritten document. The third objection will be they may admit the document, but they will dispute the correctness of the content. So they may say that what the document says is not correct, or what is known as they may dispute the truth of the contents. They may also deny receipt. They may say that, yes, this is a document which appears to even be in the handwriting of a particular person, but I have never received this document. So receipt may be denied. Other than that, objections may also arise on admissibility. For example, a document which is inadequately stamped is sought to be tendered. So if the document is inadequately stamped and cannot be taken on record, that can also be an objection that is raised. A document which may be required to be registered is sought to be tendered. Again, that can be an objection and you may not get your document marked. And also is on privilege. So on privilege may be the fact that it may be correspondence between an advocate and his client, which the client may say is privileged communication. It may be without prejudice correspondence exchange between two parties, which one side may choose to rely upon also, which can be objected to as being inadmissible. So there are broadly these 5 or 6 objections that can be raised. And all these objections essentially can be broken down into 2 categories. One is on inherent inadmissibility. And what I say when I mean inherently inadmissible is documents which are not registered, not stamped, without prejudice, client privileged or privileged communications. These are documents which the other side just cannot admit into evidence because they are inherently inadmissible. The other objections are not on admissibility, but on mode of proof. For example, you've not produced the original. You're only showing a Xerox copy. Or you may say that the signature has not been proved. Or you may say that the author of the document has not been examined. You may say that these are mere newspaper reports. And you, and as an individual, cannot prove those documents. So that those are the objections on the mode of proof, not that they are inherently inadmissible. And this has some bearing and significance on how these objections are to be dealt with and the stage at which they are to be dealt with as well. So just to recap, when we say that the objections that can be raised, because Sometimes you'll be raising objections. You can raise objections about the existence of a document. You can raise objections with regard to signature or handwriting. You can admit even the signature or the existence, but deny the truth of the contents. You can deny mere receipt, and of course, the inherent inadmissibilities of it being unstamped, unregistered, or being privileged and without prejudice. So those are the types of objections that you can raise. And now, when we come to this, we really come to what is the main point of today is really the marking. Now, marking of documents takes place under Order 13, Rule 4. Now, marking of documents, what does it actually mean when we say the court marks the document? It is done at the stage really before the cross-examination starts. It is when the party files his affidavit of evidence, the witness must step into the witness box. He will affirm that this is his affidavit of evidence. And then the lawyer will actually then say that, look, these are the documents. These are the documents that are maybe admitted to. These are the documents that are objected to. And then the court will look at the affidavit of evidence, see what you have stated in that evidence to ascertain as to whether you have actually established the contents of the document, the genuineness of the documents, and even the truth of the contents. But at this stage of marking, it's done at a more prima facie. It's always going to be subject to cross-examination. So even if a document is marked in that sense, the probative value of that document is still something which will be determined by the court after all the evidence is led, and after hearing arguments, it will be decided as to whether the truth of that document has actually been proved or not. But for even that to happen, the document must be admitted in evidence. So we have to establish the basic criteria that yes, this document does exist. The document, suppose if it is a letter, yes, the document had been delivered to the other side. This has been signed by Mr. So-and-so, and that what is stated in this letter is true and correct. These are those general averments that must be there with regard to each document which you are trying to prove in your affidavit of evidence. Now, when these various objections are in fact taken up, sometimes, and it has happened, especially sometimes in the lower courts, judges may say, okay, fine, we'll mark all documents keeping all objections open. That actually has been criticized by the Supreme Court to say that that is not the correct way of going about it. And they say that objections must be decided at the outset and must be considered in the beginning itself. Now, 3 judgments on this, which you may just note down. One is 2003, one SEC page 1, 2008 SEC Online Bombay 1017, the famous Rasiklal Ghia case, and 2012 SEC Online Bombay 1174 in the Ayush Shakti versus Hindustan Lever case. In all these judgments, they've laid down that all these objections must be decided to first. And this is assumed more significance in view of the fact that now most of our trials which are actually happening are happening before commissioners. Now, commissioners don't have the power to actually decide any objection. So when you raise an objection before the commissioner, he will note the objection. He may even tentatively say, I am tentatively just marking this particular document as X1, X2, X3, etc. And all these objections are then to be decided by the court. But he puts the cross-examine in a quandary. Does he cross-examine on those documents or does he not cross-examine on those documents? Because if they are not to be admitted, he doesn't need to cross-examine on those documents. Considering that, the court therefore held that it is compulsory that all these objections with regard to what documents should be admitted, not admitted, must be considered first before the matter actually proceeds for the stages of cross-examination. These 3 judgments lay that down. Now, one important thing again as lawyers which we must remember that if the objection that you wish to take relates to the mode of proof, then you cannot raise it at a later stage. And what do I mean by that? Take, for example, if there is a document which is inadequately stamped. A document which, take for example, there's an email, and that email, no 65B certificate. I mean, I'm sure some will be familiar, but we will touch upon this also, that if you are producing an email, then you must have what is known as a 65B certificate to prove the genuineness and the authenticity of the email. It's a certificate which basically says that this is a true and correct replica of what is there on the computer and being printed out, etc., etc. Now, if that email is thought to be and you don't object on the ground that there is no 65B certificate, and the document gets marked into evidence. For example, if it's plaintiff, it's marked as exhibit P1. Then at a later stage, when you're arguing the matter, you can't say, oh, but there's no 65B certificate. This document should not have been marked as evidence. There the Supreme Court has said, sorry, you cannot raise objections on mode of proof at a later stage. You have to have raised it. If you didn't raise it and the document has been marked, it's bad luck. You need to be vigilant, is what the Supreme Court says. They say that if it relates to inherently inadmissible documents, then that is something which you can raise even at a later stage, even if the court does mark it. Now, for example, say a document which is required to be registered, but which is not registered, like a gift deed or a conveyance, and the person chooses to rely upon that, and the court still marks that document. You can always argue that the court could not have looked at that document at a later, even at a later stage. And the judgments on this, you can just quickly note down. Most important is 2003. 8 SCC 752 in the case of Venkat Chala. It draws the distinction between objections on inherently inadmissible and objections on mode of proof. And the Supreme Court says that if it is on mode of proof, then you have to raise it at that stage. And the example they give in the judgment also is that suppose a person comes with a Xerox copy of a document and you say, sorry, you can't rely upon a Xerox copy, where is the original? They say that that objection has to be raised at the outset itself. You cannot keep quiet, allow that document to get marked into evidence and later say that this is only a Xerox copy, because the reasoning of the Supreme Court is, had you raised it earlier, then the person may have very well brought the original. But by not raising it, you have deprived him then of the opportunity of trying to correct that mistake, if at all. So, this judgment is extremely important on noticing this distinguishing feature between inherent inadmissibility and mode of proof and when the objection can be taken. Other judgments also now on stamping. Stamping, again, though it's something which even might relate to being inherently inadmissible, because of Section 35 of the Stamp Act, a document which is not stamped and should have been stamped, if you don't raise that issue and the document gets marked into evidence, you cannot raise that as a issue at a later stage. Those judgments are 2006, 11 SCC 331, AIR 61 SC 1655, and the 2011 judgment of the Supreme Court in SNST estates. And the example which I gave you about the 65B certificate is from the Supreme Court decision in Sonu, which is 2017, 8 SCC 570. So when we are conducting this marking of documents, you have to be responsible and vigilant as the lawyer, as the counsel, to raise objections with regard to mode of proof at that stage itself if you wish to object to it. Because if you don't do it at a later stage, you cannot do it. So that's something which again is required to be borne in mind when we are actually carrying out this exercise of marking of documents. And when we say marking, all that it basically means is that the court will say that the letter dated 1st January 2020 is marked as P1. All that they're basically saying is that it's a really a mode of identifying that document. And when the document is admitted into evidence, it only means this much, that the court is satisfied that the party who has produced the document has established the existence and the genuineness of that document. It doesn't mean, and we'll touch upon this a little later, it doesn't mean that what is stated in that document is proved to be true. There is a difference in proving the content of the document and in proving the truth of the content of the document. And what I mean by that is, if I was to write a letter to say that Mr. X, who was conducting the renovation work, has done a terrible job and the work is absolutely substandard, I may then step into the witness box and say, yes, I wrote that letter. This is my signature, and this letter was sent by post, and here is the registered AD card also. Therefore, the contents of that letter are proved in the sense that what the letter says is here. I have proved the genuineness of the letter. I have proved my signature, and I have proved that it was delivered. So that document will get marked. The court will say, yes, the letter dated 1st January 2020 is marked as Exhibit P1. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that my content, that the work is substandard, has been proved. That is something entirely different. And that is something which you will still have to prove at another level. But once you have said that this is my signature, this is my letter, I sent this letter and it was delivered by post, it is sufficient to get that document marked into evidence. So this is again something that is important to bear in mind. So that takes me then to the next topic, which is on what is it that you need to establish or prove to get these documents marked. We've seen the objections, we've seen the time for raising the objections and how objections are to be dealt with. So now what is it that you need to prove? Now this really is something which is set out in a sequential order in the Evidence Act. And if we could, Neeraj, if you could just go straight to section 61 of the Evidence Act. Now, I'll just tell you very briefly. Section 61 to 66 of the Evidence Act deal with what is known as proving the contents of the document. All of this comes in chapter 5, which is of documentary evidence. 61 to 66 will deal with proving the contents of the document, which essentially means you prove the existence of the document and you prove that this document does actually exist and this is what it says. 67 to 78 will deal with genuineness of the document, which is on signature, handwriting, the fact that it's not under coercion, undue influence, duress, etc., etc. And then the third part is on the truth of the contents. So when we now talk about when you have to prove the contents of the document, what does that necessarily mean? We come first to section 61. Now, if we see 61, what does it say? The contents of the document may be proved either by primary or by secondary evidence. 62 says that the primary evidence of a document is the document itself. So when you want to rely upon a document to say that there is a document which shows, or there is a document by which the defendant has, take for example, written to me accepting that the workmanship was not up to par, then if you want to prove that document, your oral say-so is not sufficient as the primary evidence of the content of that document. To prove what a document says, you must produce the document itself. So that is what section 62. Now, explanation 1 says where a document is executed in several parts, each part is the primary evidence of the document. Where a document is executed in counterpart, each counterpart being executed by one or more of the parties, each counterpart is also primary evidence. Now, when we come then to 63, it talks about what is secondary evidence. Now, secondary evidence means and includes certified copies given under the provisions hereinafter contained, copies made from the original by mechanical process, which in themselves ensure the accuracy of the copy, copies made from or compared with the original, counterpart of documents as against the parties who did not execute them, and oral accounts of the contents of a document given by a person who has himself seen it. Now, all these five are important, but broadly speaking, what secondary evidence is a copy of the original, not a copy of a copy, but a copy of the original made in such a way that it is an accurate and identical replication of what the original contains. So the classic example, of course, is Xerox copies. It is a copy which is made by a mechanical process which will ensure the accuracy of the copy, and the copy compared with such copies, and copies made from or compared with the original. So the evidence in that, your documentary evidence, is either your primary evidence, which is the actual document itself, or the secondary evidence, which is the copies. And that fifth one is interesting because it says oral accounts of the contents of a document given by some person who has himself seen it. Now, as you all might know, 91 and 92 of the Evidence Act prohibits oral evidence, which is to contradict, alter, vary, or add to the contents of a document. So you cannot lead any oral evidence which is contrary to the contents of a document. But if that actual document is not there, you don't have the original document. Suppose you don't even have a Xerox copy. Under 63(5), you can lead oral evidence about the contents of the document. But the person who has given that oral evidence must be a person who has seen the original document and must have read it himself. So this is important in that sense to know. Now 64 says, if we come to 64, that the documents must be proved by primary evidence except in the cases hereinafter mentioned. And 65 is cases in which the secondary evidence relating to documents may be given. So it says that secondary evidence may be given of the existence, condition, or contents of the documents in the following cases. Then A is where the original is shown or appears to be in the possession or power of the person against whom the document is sought to be proved. That obviously means that if I am suing Mr. X, who is the defendant, and the original is with Mr. X, then I can rely upon the copy which is available with me. B, when the existence, condition, or contents of the original have been proved to be admitted in writing by the person against whom it is proved, or by his representative in interest, where the other side admits obviously the document, then you don't need the original. C, when the original has been destroyed or lost, or when the party offering evidence of its contents cannot, for any other reason not arising from his own default or neglect, produce it in reasonable time. So this is when the original has been lost or destroyed. And F, when the original is a document of which a certified copy is permitted by this act or by any other law for the time in India. So when we are relying upon plans, when we are relying upon even say certified copies of leave and license agreements in a mean profit application, if they are certified to be true copies by the sub-registrar of assurances in the manner set out, which we had seen from section 74 onwards, then those certified copies can be relied upon as the secondary evidence. You don't have to call the author of those documents
There are some technical issues. We will start in a minute.
Yeah, Devendra, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. My thing just got cut off and I had to re-log in again.
Yes, sir, you can start.
Yeah, sorry. So where was I just now? On yeah, the various sections. Just one second. My screen seems to have. Yeah. Right. So on 64, which basically says that the document must be proved by primary evidence, except in the cases mentioned in section 65. And 65 essentially sets out the various circumstances, such as if the document is in the custody of the defendant, or if the original is misplaced, etc. Now, just to speed along, otherwise I'd be running short again on time. What's important is that we saw that the first explanation in 65 is that if the original is with the defendant, you can rely upon a copy. But 65 must be read with 66. And section 66 says that if the original is with the defendant, then you must give notice to that defendant or to the other party to produce the original. And it is only if he refuses to produce that original that you can then rely upon the Xerox copy. So what we can see from 61 to 65 is this, that in order to prove the contents or the existence of that document, you must produce the original document itself. You cannot straight come with a Xerox copy and say, well, it's a Xerox copy of the original and hence it must be admitted. The Xerox copy is only secondary evidence. And in view of 64 of the Evidence Act, it says that the document must be proved by primary evidence, except in the cases made out under 65. So you would then, if you want to rely upon a Xerox copy, have to first either explain what has happened to that original. Why is that original not available? You would have to lead evidence to say, for example, that the original was available in my records, but when I looked for it, I couldn't find it. There must have been a file which is misplaced. I've looked over at 1, 2, 3 places. Despite a due and diligent search, I've not been able to locate it. But I do have one Xerox copy. This Xerox copy was made from the original. When it was made, I compared it, and there it's an exact replica of the original. And if you say all that, you have then made out a case for leading of that secondary evidence of that document. Again, when you wish to lead secondary evidence, you don't have to file an application for leading secondary evidence, but you must explain in your affidavit of evidence itself why you are relying upon the secondary evidence or the Xerox copy. Now, two judgments on this point is 2009, 6 SCC 681, and 2007, 5 SCC, page 730. And these two judgments basically set out what is known as the best evidence rule. which basically say that if you do wish to prove a document, then you must come with the best evidence or the original. And it is only in the circumstances set out in 63, 64, 65 that you can rely upon what is known as secondary evidence. So that really is the manner of proving what is called the contents of the document, or what, I mean, actually saying that, look, this is what the document says, here's the original. You can see now from the document itself what are its contents. Now, when it comes to electronic evidence, which is today more and more, we're seeing less letters actually being sent by post or by handwritten. Everything is going by email. So the Evidence Act is amended and section 65A and 65B have been introduced. And they basically, 65B talks about the certificate which must accompany any electronic record of, any record of an electronic document. For judgments, and this is something which is still a bit of a gray area. 2005, 11 SCC page 600, or what is the Navjot Sandhu case, the Supreme Court went and held that a 65B certificate is not mandatory. In 2014, 10 SCC 473, the Supreme Court said that in Bashir's case, that Navjot Sindhu is not correct and 65B is mandatory. In 2017, 8 SCC 570, they have held, as I pointed out earlier, that if the 65B certificate is not produced and no objection is taken at the time of marking of the documents, at a later stage, you cannot raise that objection. But surprisingly, in 2018, it's 2018, 2 SCC 801, in the Shafi Muhammad case, the Supreme Court has watered down the decision in 2014 in Bashir's case to the limited extent by saying that 65B certificate is required only if the printout is being produced by the person who is in control of the device. But if you're not in control of the device and you're producing the document, it's all right. You don't need the 65B certificate, which kind of waters down the mandatory requirement laid down in 2014 Supreme Court. I am told that this is now being referred to a larger bench. I'm not sure. I haven't found that order of reference. But if any of you all have, please do share it. So again, the 65B certificate, in short, when you see 65B is a long section, I won't read it out because we'll run very short of time. But it basically says that the printout which is being produced is being printed out from a machine which has the original. You have to identify that machine, you have to identify the printer, and you have to basically say that everything is working fine and that this printout is the exact copy of what is available in the in the device. If that is there, then the presumption is therefore created that this is, in that sense, the true document, and it can in fact be looked into, and its existence and its contents have been proved. So 61 to 65 deals with the contents of the document, or its existence, its existence and contents. Then comes the genuineness of the document, and that comes from section 67 now of the Evidence Act. If we see 67 of the Evidence Act, it talks about the signature and the handwriting. It says that if a document is alleged to be signed or to have been written wholly or in part by any person, the signature or the handwriting of so much of the document as is alleged to be in that person's handwriting must be proved to be in his handwriting. So when you are relying upon a document which is signed by an individual, you must make the averment that this is that person's signature. It's always best that the author of the document is the person who is giving evidence, but we all know that that seldom happens. So the person who is then giving evidence must say that he is familiar with that signature. He can identify the signature. He has seen the person sign, and hence prove the actual signature or the handwriting. Without that, that document will not get marked because you've not proved it if it is being obviously objected to by the other side. So if, for example, so that is one thing. You have to say that. The other two ways also of proving a document. One is by leading expert evidence under section 45 of the Evidence Act, which basically talks about where you invite a handwriting expert to comment upon whether this is in fact the signature or not. And the other way is under sections 47 read with 73 is the court itself can compare signatures and also see whether or not the handwriting or the signature is proved. But it's always important that when we lead our evidence, we put in these necessary averments to actually establish and prove the handwriting and the signature of the person mentioned at the bottom of the document. Because without that, the genuineness of that document will not be proved. Now, if we see 68, if we go on, this is about documents which are required to be attested. So if a document is required by law to be attested, it shall not be used as evidence until one attesting witness at least has been called for the purpose of proving its execution. Now, this classically obviously applies in the cases of wills, whereas we all know that wills have to be attested by two witnesses. So even aside from the succession law, even under the Evidence Act, if a document is required to be attested, then at least one attesting witness must come forward to prove that document. Then, now under 69, if there is no attesting witness, then you must prove the handwriting of the testator and the attesting witness. So in cases where no attesting witness is available, it's not then that you just cannot prove the document. The person who is giving evidence now has to give evidence of not only the signature of the testator, but even of the attesting witness. Then under 71, if the attesting witness denies, you can even prove the document by other means. So if the attesting witness denies or does not recollect the execution of the document, its execution may be proved by other evidence. So an interesting question came up before the Supreme Court, especially in relation to wills, and said it was a case where the attesting witness of the will said, no, I don't recollect the gentleman actually having signed this document, and I don't recollect myself. So the party then said, all right, even if he doesn't recollect, I'll rely upon other evidence to try and prove it. Supreme Court in 2015, 8 SCC 615 said that insofar as wills are concerned, if the attesting witness does not admit that execution, there is no other means of then proving that document. And you cannot rely on section 71. I already told you 73 is also that court can compare signature. And the other aspect on genuineness also, and it again, all of this, what you need to ultimately prove depends upon the objection. For example, if the other side says that, oh, this document has been executed under coercion, etc., then you will also have to then lead evidence to show how there is no coercion if the other side has made out that case. Now, one important judgment again which you'll need to read is Mubarak Ali. That's AIR 57, Supreme Court 857. And it basically draws upon a concept of what is called chain of correspondence. Now, suppose that there are letters which are going back and forth, which form one continuous chain. Then, and a document which you are producing, you may not have the means of actually showing how that document was delivered to the other side. But if that document is reflected in some other correspondence and it forms a chain, then that whole chain of correspondence, in fact, goes in. So that's one other important aspect of proving. The other point which we needed, so we've seen now is the contents that must be proved. The genuineness of the document must be proved. You may have situations where the party may say, yes, this may be in his signature, but I have never received it. Then in that case, you will have to actually lay down the evidence in your affidavit of evidence to overcome that objection by saying, who posted it? When was it posted? How was it posted? Do you have the receipts of the postal authorities? Do you have proof that you made that payment? Do you have an acknowledgement due card? all those documents also must be retained and then must be produced along with the evidence to show how the document was actually put into transit. And if it is email correspondence, then obviously it's again the 65B certificate. Insofar as admissibility is concerned, the 3 points really are stamping, privilege, and without prejudice. If your document is inadequately stamped and you realize it, it is better that you get it adjudicated, stamped, pay those fees if you are liable to pay it, and get the document so that there is no dispute at a later stage by which the trial then gets delayed because the document is impounded and the trial won't go further. Insofar as privilege is concerned, obviously we all know that attorney-client privilege, etc., and you can't be then compelled to disclose those documents. Only one interesting judgment in the case of Chevron versus Pennzoil, it's a US judgment, 974, Federal Reporter 2 series, page 1156, where the US court basically went and said that if a party is relying upon a legal opinion of its lawyers as a defense for certain action that it may have taken or may not have taken, it then cannot say that that document is privileged. Because if it is using what would otherwise be a privileged document as its mainstay of its defense, it then must disclose that document. And insofar as without prejudice is concerned, 2 judgments. One is, of course, Peacock Plywood. I'm sure a lot of you all will have come across this. That's 2006, 12 SCC 673. And Oberoi Constructions. That's 2008, SCC Online Bombay 102. And what these judgments basically say is that merely by writing the word without prejudice on a document doesn't make the document without prejudice. A document may be without prejudice even if it's not mentioned without prejudice. What you have to see is when was that document written? For what purpose was that document written? Was it to try and bring about a settlement? Was it to try and resolve an issue? And maybe something had been mentioned in that document which was in the course of a negotiation. Then even if that document is not marked without prejudice, the courts will still treat it as without prejudice. And obviously, as we know, without prejudice documents cannot be relied upon in courts. Insofar as cassette recordings are concerned, how to prove those, please see this judgment. It's 2010 for SCC 329. I don't have time to take you all through the judgment, but you all can read it. It basically sets out what you need to establish to get cassette recorded evidence, voice recordings on record. So these broadly are the parameters that you will need to prove in order to get the documents marked. Now, when we are dealing with public documents, as I had indicated, I said that there were certain presumptions that exist, which you can avail of. Now, when we see 74 to 79 of the Evidence Act, and even section 114 of the Evidence Act, there is a presumption that those documents are proved. Now, very often when we are dealing with cases of, if we see, for example, 77 of the Evidence Act, just quickly, we saw 74, which says what is a public document, 75 says private document, 76 is certified copies. Now, 77, proof of documents by production of certified copies. Such certified copies may be produced in proof of the contents of public documents or parts of the public documents of which they purport to be copies. So you can produce a certified copy as proof of the contents of that public document, which is why when we're dealing with mean profit applications, or you're trying to show what exactly is the value of a property, say for example in a suit for specific performance in your alternate claim for damages, you can rely upon the certified copy of another of a leave and license agreement or another sale transaction of another similarly situated flat. Normally, you would not be allowed to rely upon a document which was executed between 2 other parties over which you have no connection, because you could never prove the contents of the document or the truths of the contents of the document or even its execution, because you're not a party to it. You would have to go and actually summon those people to come and give evidence and produce that document, which obviously is time consuming. It's also very inconvenient for those third parties who got nothing to do with your dispute to come and give evidence. So the Evidence Act therefore allows you to rely upon, as proof of the contents of the document, a certified copy of that public document. And when we saw the definition of public document, it is even a public record of a private document. So if you are relying upon certified copies, the burden in that sense is actually discharged by the presumption that yes, these are the contents, this is what the document says. But it must obviously be certified by the public authority. You can't just come with any ordinary copy and say, here's a certified copy. It has to be a certified copy as mentioned in the section. Now, just some judgments on this. One is 2001, 6 SCC 254, AIR 63 SC 1633. And an interesting judgment of the Bombay High Court, it's unreported. It's Bombay High Court. It's Notice of Motion 632 of 2014 in suit number 788 of 2004, judgment dated 15th October 15, which again talks about certified copies of leave and license agreements as being public documents, and that the court is bound to accept the existence and the contents of that document. The Supreme Court in Jaswant Singh versus Gurdev Singh also has said that consent decrees which are registered, you can produce a certified copy of that and it would be taken cognizance of by the court. So when you're dealing with a public document, you don't have to always get the author to prove the existence of that document. You can rely upon that certified copy. Insofar as documents which are 30 years old, again under section 90 of the Evidence Act, there is a presumption which arises about the existence and the genuineness of that document. If we just see section 90 of the Evidence Act, Neeraj. Yeah. Now, presumption as to documents 30 years old, where any document purporting or proved to be 30 years old is produced from any custody which the court in the particular case considers proper, the court may presume that the signature and every other part of such document which purports to be in the handwriting of any particular person is in that person's handwriting. And in the case of a document executed or attested, that it was validly executed and attested by the persons by whom it purports to be executed and attested. Documents are said to be in proper custody if they are in the place in which and under the care of the person with whom they would naturally be. But no custody is improper if it is proved to have a legitimate origin, or if the circumstances of the particular case are such as to render such an origin probable. So when you have a document which is more than 30 years old, there is again a presumption that automatically arises with regard to the fact that the document is in the signature of that person, the handwriting of that person. If it's attested, it's presumed to be validly attested. So again, the burden of proving that document, if it is more than 30 years old, is greatly discharged in that sense by the presumption. However, these are all rebuttable presumptions. So it's always prudent to still, in your affidavit of evidence, establish as explicitly as possible all these various parameters right from 61 onwards of the Evidence Act to proving the various components or aspects such as Supreme Court in 2009 and 2013 indicated that Section 68 is a special mode. This is relating to wills. and 90 does not apply to it. They say that to prove a will, because it's specifically mentioned that you must lead the evidence of the attesting witness, you cannot rely upon that presumption. However, these two judgments did not note two earlier judgments. One is a 47 Privy Council and one is a 68 Supreme Court, which says that of course the presumption will apply. Then this now in that sense has been noted by, in fact, the Kerala High Court in Narayan Menon versus Sukumaran Menon. And they note this inconsistency, and I'm assuming now that this matter is going to obviously go up to the Supreme Court, and it's in that sense going to be decided. However, our Bombay High Court has in 2019 in Shanti Devi versus Kasturma followed the Bharpur Singh, the 2009 Supreme Court judgment, to say that the presumption under Section 90 does not apply in the case of wills. So that deals then with the various types of documents. The other point really is that if you have established all these criteria, as I had indicated, one of course is the existence of the document, the genuineness, the handwriting, the signature, the proof of delivery of the document to the other side, your document will be marked. But as I had pointed out in the beginning, just because the document gets marked, it doesn't mean that the truth of the contents of that document are automatically proved. And this is an important distinction that needs to be borne in mind, because you cannot just say that because the document is marked, the court has to believe that what is stated therein is the gospel truth. No. An extremely important judgment is Om Prakash Berlia. It's AIR 83 Bombay, page 1. Strongly recommend that read this judgment once, twice, thrice over. And it draws that distinction between proving the contents of a document and proving the truth of the contents of a document. And again, that classic example is that if I write to the other side and say that the workmanship is bad, I will get the document marked because I step into the witness box and I will say that, yes, I wrote this letter and it's under my signature, I posted it, they received it. But that doesn't mean that the workmanship is bad. I will have to independently still prove that. And I would probably have to prove that either by leading my own expert evidence or for example, to say, oh, despite them, say building the wall collapsed in one rain, or that there are leakages, all that will still have to be, you have to prove the truth of those contents. Now, this is that Om Prakash Berlia, and that's an important distinction to be noted and to be borne in mind when you're reading your evidence. So your evidence cannot just be a repetition of what that letter says. You will have to independently prove the contents of those letters to show that those contents are true. Now that obviously how that is to be done depends upon the facts of the case, the fact in issue. What would you need to ultimately establish that what is stated in that letter is true and correct? The letter will only, in that sense, prove that I informed this fact to the other side. However, in a situation where what you are trying to prove, say, is a contract which is signed by both parties, then obviously the truth of the contents doesn't become so relevant, because then what you are actually essentially proving is that, yes, there is a concluded contract. I signed it, he signed it, you prove the signatures, and then the document speaks for itself. So depending upon the fact scenario in each case, how you are to prove that document or the truth of the contents obviously changes. However, it is important, again, I'm just repeating it, is AR 83 Bombay, page 1, the distinction between proving the contents and the truth of the contents. One other judgment which encapsulates very nicely what I've basically spoken about today is, again, I'm surprised, but it's an unreported judgment. In the case of Dadi Banaji versus Jijina, it's a 5th September 2014 judgment of Justice Gupte. Please read that. It sets out these various concepts in a very, very lucid, simple manner. And right now, as I had this thing, last point really is this. that when we had seen now that all our documentary evidence must come in either with the plaint or before the settlement of issues in our affidavit of documents and in the compilation of documents, we had seen that Order 7, Rule 14, 4 of the CPC, read with 145 of the Evidence Act, basically says that none of these principles apply to documents which are being shown or to a witness in the course of cross-examination. So when you wish to confront a witness in cross-examination with something, then you can rely upon documents that are even outside that compilation. But there are certain restrictions. It's not that you can just rely upon anything. In 1982, 1 SCC page 700, paragraph 13 of the judgment says that the documents you can confront the witness with are documents of which the witness is the author. It's not any and every document. And there's a very interesting judgment of Justice Khanvilkar when he was in the Bombay High Court of 2004, 6 VCR page 18, which basically says that when you are showing documents to a witness in the course of cross-examination, they must be documents to confront the witness with some testimony that he has given at that point of time. It can't be that you are showing documents only to try and prove your case through that witness. So it can't, and you can show a document. Suppose if the witness goes and says that no minutes of meetings were ever recorded, and you have minutes of meetings, you can confront the witness with those minutes of meetings, even if they didn't form part of your affidavit of documents. But for example, if part of your defense is that there were minutes which were actually held, and the other side hasn't mentioned it or said anything about it, you can't just go and say, are these the minutes of a meeting which took place between you and the plaintiff? You can't just try and prove your case by confronting with the witness with documents. The documents or the confrontation can only be to confront the witness with things that have actually transpired during that cross-examination. There's also a judgment of Justice Dalvi, that's 2011, 3 Maharashtra Law Journal 558, which can be noted on this point, and 2012, 6 Maharashtra Law Journal, page 648. Right. And just again, where one other question which often comes up is on books of accounts. How do you prove books of accounts? Under books of accounts, you can again see Order 13 and Section 34 of the Evidence Act. And just two judgments that I'll quickly touch upon. That's 2009, 13 SCC, page 1, and 2013, 3 Maharashtra Law Journal, page 6, which basically says that if accounts, if you have made statements that these accounts are being maintained in the regular course of business, and I am producing them, or this is an extract, etc., then that is sufficient for getting the accounts being taken on record. So to sum up, when you are essentially, so marking of these documents really is in that sense a prima facie view that the court takes, or not prima, but in the sense that they go through the affidavit of evidence, and on the basis of what is stated in the affidavit of evidence, they will then see whether you have managed to prove three things. One is that have you proved the content? When I mean the content is that have you brought the original document? Is it in that sense only a Xerox? Did you need to, have you led secondary evidence, not led secondary evidence if it is a Xerox? Have you proved the signatures? Have you proved the handwriting? Have you proved the fact that this document has been sent by post? If it is email, have you got the 65B certificate? If you have proved all that, then it is sufficient for you to make sure that that document will get marked into evidence. So it's very important when you draft your affidavits of evidence to make sure that all these averments are there. Please never ever cut, copy, paste your plaint into your affidavit of evidence. That is the surest recipe for disaster. you have to actually analyze what it is you need to prove, see which documents are objected to, see the nature of the objections, and then lead your evidence to overcome those objections and establish how those objections are incorrect. And other important points I informed you all is that there's a big difference between proving the contents and the truth of the contents. So in your evidence, despite getting the document marked, you still have to prove that the truth of the contents have been established by leading substantial evidence as well. And insofar as the stage, again, please note that today, when you'll draft your plans, make sure that you all have mentioned all the documents you'll want to rely upon. Take a little bit of extra time, put all of it in. And if there are new documents in your evidence, you must establish why those documents were not referred to earlier. So thank you very much. And that concludes what I wanted to say.
So here we conclude our webinar. Thank you, sir, for enlightening us on today's topic. It was indeed a very informative session for all of us. And we are looking forward to have many more sessions by you in the near future. Thank you so much, sir. Secondly, I would also like to thank all the participants, those who have joined. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.